It was a red metal case the size of a briefcase, and it was heavier than anything you had ever been given for Christmas. You unlatched the two clasps on the front. The lid swung open. Inside were rows of small glass bottles with handwritten labels and cork stoppers, a rack of test tubes, a tiny scale, an alcohol lamp, and a booklet that said you could make invisible ink, erupting volcanoes, and crystals that grew overnight. You were 10 years old, and you had just been handed the keys to another universe. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. You carried it down to the basement, and you set it on the workbench your father never used. You open the booklet to experiment number 1, and you read the instructions 3 times because this was not a toy, and you knew it. You poured a few drops from bottle number 12 into a test tube and added a pinch of powder from bottle number 7. The liquid turned from clear to deep purple right in front of your eyes. Your hands were shaking because you had just made something happen that you did not fully understand, and it was the most powerful feeling you had ever had in your life. You were not playing. You were not pretending. You were doing something real, something that changed one thing into another thing, and no toy you had ever owned could do that. The smell hit you first, and it never left you. Sulfur and iron and something sharp that burned the inside of your nose and made your eyes water, and you loved it because it meant the experiment was working. That smell lived in the basement for years. Your mother could detect it from the kitchen, and she would yell down the stairs to ask what you were doing, and you would yell back nothing, because explaining what you were doing would have taken longer than doing it. And besides, she would not have understood that her 10-year-old son had just dissolved a penny in acid and was watching it disappear molecule by molecule into a green liquid that used to be clear. The alcohol lamp was the best part and the most terrifying part, and you were not supposed to use it without an adult present. But you used it every single time without an adult present because no adult in your house knew what a graduated cylinder was, and you had read the booklet twice and you were confident you could handle a flame the size of a birthday candle. You held the test tube with a metal clamp over the tiny blue flame, and you watched the liquid inside begin to bubble and change color, and you felt like you were standing at the edge of something enormous, something that connected you to every scientist who had ever lived. You were 11 years old in a basement in Ohio, and the carpet already had 3 stains that would never come out. Your friends had chemistry sets too. Billy down the street had the big Chemcraft, the one with 60 bottles and the real balance scale, and you were jealous of that set the way other kids were jealous of bicycles. Danny had the Gilbert, which came in a green metal case instead of red, and the Gilbert booklet had different experiments than yours, so you traded chemicals back and forth across the neighborhood like currency. You brought your bottle number 14 to Billy's house, and he gave you a pinch of something from his bottle number 38, and together you mixed them in his garage and produced a smell so foul that his father came out and banned chemistry from the premises for the rest of the summer. You went home grinning because you had just learned that science had consequences, and consequences were the entire point. By the end of the first week, you had completed every experiment in the beginner section of the booklet. By the end of the first month, you were deep into the advanced section, the pages where the instructions got longer, the warnings got more serious, and the results got more spectacular. You learned to grow crystals that took 3 days to form and look like something from another planet when you held them up to the window. You learned to make invisible ink that only appeared when you heated the paper over the alcohol lamp. And your best friend's jaw dropped when a message materialized out of nothing on a blank sheet of notebook paper. You learned that mixing 2 clear liquids could produce a solid that sank to the bottom of the test tube like snow falling in a jar. Every experiment was a small miracle, and you were the one performing it. Nobody had to tell you to keep going because the booklet was your guide and curiosity was the only fuel you needed. And then Sputnik went up, October 1957. A metal ball the size of a basketball orbiting the Earth every 96 minutes, beeping, and every adult in America looked at the sky with fear, and every child in America looked at the sky with wonder. Suddenly, the chemistry set was not just a toy, and it was not just a hobby, it was preparation. The government poured money into science education. The slogan on the Chemcraft box changed from experimenter today, scientist tomorrow, to Porter Science prepares young America for world leadership. And for once, the advertising was not exaggerating. President Kennedy stood before the nation and said, "We choose to go to the moon." In basements and garages from coast to coast, boys who had been mixing chemicals since Christmas morning believed with absolute certainty that they were part of that mission. The chemistry set was their training ground. The basement was their laboratory. The periodic table on the wall was their map. And the future they had been promised by every magazine cover and television broadcast and presidential speech was something they could touch with their own hands, one experiment at a time, one bottle at a time, one reaction at a time. The sets came from two companies that most people have forgotten, but that quietly shaped the childhood of almost every boy in America for 40 years. The first was Porter Chemical, started in 1914 by two brothers named John and Harold Porter, who assembled their first kits in the basement of their home in Hagerstown, Maryland. They called their product Chemcraft, and within a few years it was sold in Woolworth stores across the country. By the time the Second World War ended, children on every continent were writing letters addressed simply to Chemcraft, USA, and the Postal Service knew exactly where to deliver them. The other was A.C. Gilbert, founded by a man named Alfred Carlton Gilbert, who had paid his way through Yale Medical School by performing magic tricks on street corners. He never became a doctor. He became a toy maker instead, and in 1918 he testified before the United States Congress to prevent a wartime ban on toy manufacturing, and the newspapers called him the man who saved Christmas. Between them, Porter and Gilbert put a chemistry set into the hands of almost every child in America who wanted one. You found them at Woolworth's behind the glass counter, stacked by size from the small beginner set that cost $1.50 to the big one, the one with the real balance scale and 60 numbered bottles, the one you circled in the Sears catalog every October and prayed for every December. The red Chemcraft case and the green Gilbert case became as recognizable on Christmas morning as a baseball glove or a pair of Keds. Your mother wrapped it, but she could not disguise it because nothing else under the tree weighed that much, and you knew by the weight alone what was inside. The slogan on the Chemcraft box read, "Experimenter today, scientist tomorrow," and it was not just marketing, it was a prophecy that came true in living rooms and basements and garages across the country, one experiment at a time. What made those sets extraordinary was what was inside them. Not the modern version you can buy today at a retail store, which contains baking soda and vinegar and a pair of plastic goggles and instructions for making a pretend volcano. The real ones, the originals. Those sets contained potassium permanganate that could turn water purple or strip the color from fabric. They contained sodium ferrocyanide. They contained sulfur that smelled like the end of the world. Some contained iodine that stained everything it touched for weeks. The alcohol lamp burned with a real flame that could heat a test tube until the liquid inside boiled. Some of the advanced sets contained chemicals that were genuinely poisonous if swallowed and genuinely dangerous if mixed incorrectly. And the most famous set of all, the Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Laboratory, came with 4 sealed jars of actual radioactive uranium ore, a Geiger counter, a cloud chamber, and an instruction manual that taught children how to observe nuclear disintegration in their bedroom. Nobody called the authorities. Nobody organized a protest. Nobody filed a lawsuit. Your parents read the label on the box, decided you were old enough, and handed you a set that contained materials a modern parent would not allow within 50 feet of a child. And the result was not a generation of injured children. The result was a generation of scientists, engineers, doctors, chemists, and physicists who traced the beginning of their careers to a red metal case they opened on a Christmas morning when they were 10 years old. The chemistry set did something that almost no other toy in American history has done. It treated children like they were capable of handling real things, not simplified things, not dumbed-down things. Real glass test tubes that could break, real chemicals that could stain or burn or produce a smell that cleared a room, real fire from a real flame. The set assumed that a child who was curious enough to open the booklet was responsible enough to follow the instructions, and for 40 years that assumption proved correct millions of times over. The chemistry set trusted children, and children rose to meet that trust, and in the process they learned something far more valuable than the chemical formula for invisible ink. They learned that they could figure things out on their own. They learned that failure was part of the process. They learned that the world was made of substances that could be combined and separated and transformed. And that understanding how this worked gave you a kind of power that nothing else in childhood could provide. Then the laws came. The Federal Hazardous Substances Labeling Act in 1960 required warning labels on toxic materials. The Toy Safety Act of 1969 gave the government authority to ban any toy deemed hazardous. The Consumer Product Safety Commission was established in 1972. The Toxic Substances Control Act followed in 1976. Each law was reasonable, each law was well-intentioned, and each law stripped another chemical, another experiment, another piece of real science from the red metal case until what remained was a shadow of what it had been. Harold Porter died in 1963. Alfred Carlton Gilbert died in 1961. Both companies lost the men who understood that the purpose of a chemistry set was not to be safe. The purpose was real. Without their founders, the companies drifted. Gilbert closed in 1967. Porter held on until 1984. The factory shut down. The glass bottles with their cork stoppers and handwritten labels disappeared from store shelves. The alcohol lamps were replaced by nothing. The chemicals were replaced by substances so mild they could not produce a reaction visible to the human eye. The shelf at Woolworths where the red metal cases once stood in a row from small to large was cleared and restocked with something else. And within a few years, nobody walking past that shelf remembered what had been there. An entire category of childhood experience was dismantled piece by piece, law by law, until what remained had no relationship to what had come before. They kept the name. They kept the box. They removed everything that mattered. The generation that grew up with real chemistry sets watched it happen and said nothing, because the arguments for safety were reasonable and the arguments for trust were impossible to quantify. How do you measure the value of a 10-year-old standing alone in a basement with a flame and a test tube, learning for the first time that he is capable of something difficult and dangerous and beautiful? How do you put a number on the moment a child realizes he can change the world at the molecular level? You cannot. And so the laws won, and the companies closed, and the red metal cases became antiques instead of gifts, and a generation of children who might have become scientists became something else instead. Today you can walk into any toy store in America and find something called a chemistry set. It comes in a cardboard box with a smiling child on the front, wearing safety goggles and a lab coat 2 sizes too large. Inside you will find plastic cups, a plastic eyedropper, a packet of baking soda, a bottle of vinegar, and a set of instructions that will teach your child to produce a small fizzing reaction that looks exactly like what happens when you clean your kitchen sink. There is no glass, there is no fire, there is no sulfur, there is no purple liquid, there is no moment where your hands shake because you have just transformed one substance into another and you do not fully understand how. There is nothing in that box. that will make a child fall in love with science because there is nothing in that box that is real? A boy who opens that box today will complete every experiment in 20 minutes and never think about chemistry again. A boy who opened the red metal Chemcraft in 1962 spent the entire Christmas vacation in the basement and emerged in January a different person. That is not nostalgia talking. That is a fact that can be measured in the careers that followed, in the patents that were filed, in the medicines that were developed, in the bridges that were built, in the rockets that flew. The distance between those two boys, the one with the baking soda and the one with the sulfur, is the distance between entertainment and transformation, and it is a distance that grows wider every year. The neurologist Oliver Sacks, who spent his life studying the human brain and who traced his own passion for science to a chemistry set he received as a child, wrote that if chemistry sets cannot come back, a certain realm of childhood may be lost forever. He was not being dramatic. He was being precise. The chemistry set occupied a space in a child's life that no other object has ever filled. It was not a game. It was not entertainment. It was a door. You opened it and you walked through, and on the other side was a version of yourself that understood the world differently than you had understood it the day before. And once you walked through that door, you never walked back. Every year at reunions across this country, men in their 60s and 70s sit together at tables and talk about what launched them into their careers. And the answer over and over again is the same. Not a teacher, not a textbook, not a television program, a red metal case with 2 clasps on the front and rows of numbered bottles inside, and a booklet that began with experiment number 1 and ended with a child who believed for the first time in his life that he could understand how the world was put together. Engineers say it, doctors say it, researchers say it. The man who spent 40 years designing bridges and the man who spent 30 years studying cells under a microscope, and the woman who spent her career developing medicines that saved lives all point to the same beginning. A Christmas morning, a heavy box, a red metal case, the smell of sulfur in the basement, the purple liquid in the test tube, the feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous. The Porter brothers started in their basement in Hagerstown, Maryland, with a belief that children who were allowed to experiment would become adults who changed the world. Alfred Carlton Gilbert stood before Congress and argued that taking toys away from children during wartime would damage the nation's future more than any enemy could. Both men were right. Both companies are gone. Both beliefs have been replaced by a culture that wraps children in plastic and hands them a box of baking soda and calls it science. But the red metal cases are still out there, in attics, in basements, in the back of closets where men have kept them for 60 years because they could never bring themselves to throw away the thing that showed them who they were going to become. Some of the bottles are still sealed. Some of the labels are still legible. The test tubes are chipped but intact. And if you opened one of those cases today and held it up to your nose, you might still catch the faintest trace of sulfur and iron and something sharp that burns the inside of your nose and makes your eyes water. And for 1 second, you would be 10 years old again in a basement with stained carpet and an alcohol lamp burning blue, and a purple liquid in a test tube, and a booklet open to the next experiment, and a world made of substances you were just beginning to understand. And you would remember that once before the laws and the lawsuits and the plastic and the fear, someone trusted you with something real and you rose to meet it, and it changed who you became. If you ever opened a red metal case on a Christmas morning and spent the rest of that day in the basement making liquids change color and solids dissolve and crystals form out of nothing, tell me what you remember. Tell me which set you had. Tell me what you mixed, what you burned, what you spilled, and what stain is still on your mother's carpet 50 years later. Tell me if that red box made you who you are, because those sets are gone now, and the companies that made them are gone, and the only place any of it still lives is in the hands and the hearts and the careers of the children who opened them.